So good morning, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Jeff Dankeval. I am the President and CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, and it is my great pleasure, together with our partners from the SFU David Lam Center for Asian Studies, to welcome you to this morning's event. It's great to see some familiar faces and also some new guests, and we're really delighted to have you all here today. Let me begin by acknowledging that the places Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. The location we're gathered on here today is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. At APFC, we are grateful to Canada's Indigenous people for their stewardship of our land, and we are collectively committed to a process of reconciliation, and this is a particularly notable week in that regard. Today's event is on deepening Canada-Japan relations in the Indo-Pacific and commemorating the 95th anniversary of diplomatic relations. We'll be discussing the G7, Japan's new free and open Indo-Pacific outlook, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, and what these initiatives mean practically for deepening Japan-Canada ties. We will have a series of presentations, and then a short break, and then a panel discussion, followed by Q&A. I would like to thank our partners at the SFU David Lam Center for Asian Studies, Dr. Michael Hathaway, Ms. Doris Tai, the center's manager, who has been doing all the heavy lifting to make this event possible. I'd like to thank our team from the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, particularly our North Asia specialist team led by Scott Harrison. And I would, in particular, like to give thanks on behalf of all of us, and I'd like you to join me in thanking the Consulate General of Japan in Vancouver for their support for this event, not only of moral support, which is very valuable, but also financial support, which is precious. So thank you very much. And I'd like to acknowledge from the Consulate General of Japan, Deputy Consul General Satomi Okagaki, and Consul Kayo Imamura. So thank you very much. We really treasure this partnership. So it falls to me to say, I'll be saying a few words first about the background to Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, and then I will be introducing the next two speakers, then we'll have a break, and then we will have a third speaker and a panel discussion. Let me begin. Maybe first I'll introduce our speakers. So I have to my right Dr. Stephen Nagy. I think he is known to many of you, a major figure in Canada-Japan relations and an intellectual leader in this space. Dr. Nagy is a professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo. He has been also a research associate at the Waseda University and an assistant professor at the Department of Japanese Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He serves as a fellow at a number of institutions, including Canadian Global Affairs Institute, the Japan Institute for International Affairs, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and the East Asia Security Center. He's published widely in peer-reviewed international journals, and also is a frequent commentator in global media, including the New York Times, BBC, CNN, and so on. He'll be talking about Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy and its interconnected strategic objectives and potential areas for engagement, and we'll be coming to him in a few minutes. And we're also joined by Dr. Tsuyoshi Kawasaki, who's professor of political science at Simon Fraser University, a specialist in international politics, active in both Canada and Japan, and he has observed and written on Canada's relations with Asia and Japan since way back in the mid-1990s. His recent publications include the Trudeau government's New Asia Security Policy in Japanese in 2023 and Hedging Against China, formulating Canada's new strategy in the era of power politics in the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal in 2021. And he'll be presenting a little bit later on a new framework for Japan-Canada cooperation. I'd like to take the opportunity, because among the friends I see in the audience, also to acknowledge a former ambassador of Canada to Japan, Joseph Caron. Welcome. And now I really hesitate to say anything at all, because I'm in the presence of a mentor. Joseph was also my ambassador on one of my postings in Beijing, and has achieved the trifecta of being a Canadian ambassador or high commissioner in China, in Japan, China, and in India. So some of you may have some questions for him during the coffee break about any one of those relationships. Let's plunge in here, and I'm going to say just a few words about Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy to kind of set the context here. And I would say if you go up to like 30,000 feet and you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, so this was a strategy that was released in November of last year, so not yet a year old. I can tell you, so myself, I was a diplomat for Canada for 33 years, and I finished up my last 5 years as the Consul General of Canada in Hong Kong. And almost all of my career was working on Asia, mostly China, but also I was responsible for Canadian development assistance for all of Asia for 5 years in the first half of the last decade. And so I can attest to the fact that an Asia strategy for Canada is something that was in the making for a long time. I think probably Joseph may have worked on some early drafts, a decade and a half ago. This is something, and I think it's important to understand. So the Indo-Pacific Strategy, we'll call it the IPS this morning for convenience. So the IPS was released last November, but it's important to understand that there was work being done on this for, I would say, at least 5 years. The idea of an Asia strategy for Canada. And when the strategy itself was released, I think it was received, and part of this had to do with the way that it was positioned, deliberately, tactically by the government in Ottawa. But it was, many people assumed this was something that was simply a response to Indo-Pacific strategies of other players in the region, such as Japan, having presented an early vision that has been picked up on by many others many other countries in doing their strategies. But you had other players coming up with strategies in a new geo-strategic context of a challenge, particularly from China. And so particularly people who look at things from a security lens, would look at this strategy and they say, oh, this is something just like they would assume, this is something in the last couple of years that's been done in response to these other sort of strategies and needs to be seen in that light. And to be fair, I think the government in Ottawa did present it in such a way that you could interpret it that way. But I think it's important to understand that what became the Indo-Pacific Strategy had begun its life as an Asia strategy and as a very kind of deep analysis undertaken in recognition of the importance of the rise of Asia, the shift in economic weight in the world to put the fulcrum really in Asia. And that various people in various parts of the government machinery and our missions in the region had been working on strategies for economic engagement, for what are we going to promote in Canadian trade, how do we promote the Canadian brand, what about areas like education and culture and immigration, and how do we do better analysis to understand the political context in the region. And these are things that you would expect. I mean, of course, this is now, the economic part of the world is in Asia, and so you had, very comprehensive sort of task in putting together a strategy that was really grounded. Most of the work being done was in the trade and investment spheres. And then in just the last few years, we had this rapidly changing geopolitical, geostrategic context in which the government saw a need, and I think some would say this new recognition is still, Canada is still catching up in terms of integrating security and defense thinking in its foreign policy thinking, because for so many years, you know, much of what we did, I would say much of what Canada did in defense and security policy was kind of on autopilot. We've got our NATO stuff, we've got some peacekeeping, less over the years, certainly less than most Canadians think, but our kind of UN engagements, and we've got NORAD, and you know, not a lot of time in public being spent on thinking about the world in the sort of security, defense, non-traditional security terms. And so when you look at what came out as the Indo-Pacific Strategy last November, what you see, and the way it was presented, was you see China literally up front in the document. It starts with China. Minister Jolie, in her presentation that she gave, and this, you know, this had to have been a very deliberate sort of strategy. She gave a preview of the Indo-Pacific Strategy at the beginning of November last year, just before the Prime Minister and several ministers did a tour of Asia for various APEC and ASEAN-related and G20 events. And her preview of the IPS was really her speech about Canada's China strategy. So you had an Asia strategy that was many years in the making, and you had a China strategy that had evolved and was already, from what the government itself has said, was already being implemented internally, but was finally being brought into the public domain. And they bolted them together, I would say a bit awkwardly, into one document, which was received by many observers. And at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, we work with, you know, many partners across Asia. We've been spending a lot of time lately on Southeast Asia, and I can tell you, for those people who pay attention to these things in Southeast Asia, which is not a huge community, but it's an important community for us, they looked at the strategy and they said, wow, this seems to be mostly a kind of China containment framework. And as I said, as you read the strategy, it starts really with China. And so China's kind of the gateway to get into all the other stuff. I think that does it a real disservice, because there is so much more to the strategy than that. It only looks like that because of the way it came together at the very end. But I think it's important to see the elements of the strategy in their own light, and not through the lens of kind of meeting the China challenge. We'll get into some of the details. Five objectives under the strategy in areas like peace and security, expanding trade, investing in people, building a sustainable green future, and Canada as an active and engaged partner. And there's a lot of funding in these different areas. I would say in my 33 years working on Asia for Canada, it's the largest single commitment of resources that I've seen, of over $2 billion over the first 5 years of this strategy, which is meant to be at least a decade in execution. And I'll just note, in the interest of transparency, a small but I think really important element of this strategy, of the funding items under this strategy, is a commitment of $24.5 million over 5 years for the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada to open for the first time a substantial physical presence in Asia. And we're working on that right now. I expect by the middle of next year, we will be in a position to open our office, which our working plan at the moment is that it would be in Singapore, an office and convening space, as well as substantial resources for us to stand up programs focusing specifically on increasing Canada, Southeast Asia engagement, helping to build networks, helping to get mind share for Canada in Southeast Asia. And this is an area, when we talk about Japan and Canada, this is an area that I think is particularly interesting for us to explore what we can do together in that part of Asia. So I would set that as a kind of a very general context, and as a non-specialist in Japan-Canada matters, that's as far as I will go with my remarks. And so now it's my pleasure to pass the microphone on to our next speaker. So as I mentioned, Dr. Stephen Nagy from the International Christian University in Tokyo. We're delighted to have you here on Canadian shores, Stephen, as I know you are frequently. And Stephen will be talking about Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy, its strategic objectives and potential areas for engagement. So take it away, Steve.
Thanks very much, Jeff. So again, good morning everyone. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici avec tout le monde. It's really a pleasure to be here and speak here with Jeff and with Josie about our Indo-Pacific strategy. And I'm going to throw out a title to you, and I think it's important for us to be thinking about. Finally at the table, not on the menu. Canada launches its Indo-Pacific strategy. And why I say this is really important is that Canada did come late to the game. And as Jeff correctly mentioned, I think many observers looked at our Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy as being something that we were catching up to the US or catching up to Japan. But I think as Jeff mentioned, the idea of a Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy really has been, I think, about a long-term process of trying to figure out ways to engage in Asia, or the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific. And the reason why we've migrated towards the term of an Indo-Pacific strategy is, quite frankly, the economic nexus, where most of the economic growth is going to come from over the next 20 or 30 years, is going to be in the region that we call the Indo-Pacific, stretching from the Pacific Ocean through the South China Sea, through the Indian Ocean. And we want to be part of that. Canada wants to be locked into the rules-making process. We want to ensure that we're not locked out of trade agreements and locked out of the region. Importantly, and Jeff mentioned this in his initial comments, the idea of non-traditional security challenges. I can't tell you how important this is as an area of thinking about the future of the region. Whether it's climate change, whether it's transnational diseases like the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it is uncontrolled human trafficking, this region has it all. And it's going to be not only a region of economic opportunity, but I do think it's going to be a region where we're going to see a lot of instability that we need to keep ahead of. If we're not ahead of the instability, then we're going to be faced with huge challenges of dealing with the instability within the region. Lastly, of course, there's those traditional security challenges that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. But as Jeff mentioned, back in November of 2022, we launched our Indo-Pacific strategy. It has 5 pillars, promoting peace, resilience, and security. And I'm going to break that down a little bit more. Expanding trade, investment, and supply chains. Investing and connecting in people, which is so critical to forging strong, reliable, and sustainable partnerships within the region. And contributing to the environment through building a sustainable green future. And lastly, I think becoming a credible, sustainable partner within the region. And this is so important. I think as you travel through the region, as I do, people think Canada's a great country, it's nice, it's quaint, but they don't know much about us, and they have some bad memories. And I think that they want to see a credible, sustained Canadian engagement within the region. And they want to make sure that it has a Canadian brand. And the Canadian brand could be, as Jeff mentioned, education. It could be migration. It could be dealing with non-traditional security challenges. It could be many things, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But when we think about our Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, I think that we should be clear that it does very much reflect domestic priorities. Whether we're talking about some of the progressive cultural issues that are embedded in the Indo-Pacific Strategy, whether we're talking about the prioritization of the environment, these are very much domestic priorities of the current government, and they may not reflect the interests of some of the states within the region. And I say this quite openly, and I'm thankful that Jeff has given me the opportunity to speak about this frankly. I think we need to think about the region in a very realistic, pragmatic way, and some of our approaches may need fine-tuning moving forward. But that being said, it's still important to think about engaging in the region, focusing on a rules-based order, and trying to contribute to how Canada believes the key ideas of democracy, human rights, rule of law, are not only core values for Canada, but important elements for development moving forward. As I write and think about the Indo-Pacific region and try to understand how Canada should engage in the region, one of my core, I guess, ideas is really I think that Canada needs to have a sober assessment of its resources. And we really need to think about a capabilities-led approach to engaging in the region. What I mean by a capabilities-led strategic approach to engaging in the region is thinking about what are our comparative advantages. And I know scholars here in Canada that are talking about sending our naval vessels to the region. Well, I think that may be useful as a symbol. The reality is we don't have a tremendous amount of naval resources to lend to the region. And as a result, I think this may not be leveraging our comparative advantages that we have to build stability and lock in our presence within the region. So as I'm thinking about this in terms of partners like Japan, I'm thinking about some core areas of cooperation that I think will be useful, sustainable, and I think will add value to the region. And I'm just going to throw out four key areas that I think or 5 areas that I think are important. One is security cooperation to promote stability. The second is proactive middle power diplomacy that is pragmatic and realistic and focuses on working with like-minded countries. And I'll come back to that point and give you some examples. The third area is looking and thinking about cyber and digital trade cooperation. And I think this is, I'll give you some examples. Supply chain resilience and diversification. And lastly, the promotion of high-standard multilateral trade promotion. Those 5 areas, I think, are reflective of some of our comparative advantages. They allow us to plug into partnerships that are stable, like Japan, and I think that they will provide sustainable engagement within the broader Indo-Pacific region. Of course, there are other areas that we can talk about, but I'd like to just drill down into these 5 areas to give you a little bit more insight. That first area, security cooperation, promotion of stability. The magnitude of trade that goes through the Indo-Pacific, and in particular the South China Seas, is tremendous. Last year it was about 5.5 trillion US dollars. Let me repeat that. 5.5 trillion US dollars go through the Malacca Straits, the South China Sea, in and around the Straits of Taiwan, to the 3 major economies in the region, South Korea, China, and lastly Japan. Instability in these regions would not remain in the region. The region is home to semiconductor supply chains, based in Taiwan. And those semiconductors go into cars, and they go into our phones, and they go into our planes. And they go into businesses that are based in Japan, or based in Canada. If there's a disruption in those supply chains, it will not stay in the region. It will affect hundreds of thousands of jobs in Canada. And as a result, I think that the economic dimension of promoting security and sea lines of communication within the region do demand a Canadian presence. The question is, how do we deliver our resources to the region in a sustainable manner that adds value? And this is a challenge. We don't have that many vessels. So the question is, how do we provide some stability in East China Sea, or the South China Sea, or across the Taiwan Strait? And here, I think that there are some opportunities within our Indo-Pacific strategy to plug into pre-existing minilateral relationships. Plug in like Lego. We don't need to be a full partner of the Quad, but I think it's an interesting opportunity for us to provide some resources, in particular maritime domain awareness activities, to increase stability within the region. It adds value, we can deliver expertise, and we can build synergy with our partners within the region to again create stability in those critical sea lines of communication that deliver imports and exports to really the second largest economy on the planet, the third largest economy on the planet, and I think the 13th largest economy on the planet, South Korea. In terms of middle power diplomacy, here I think that this is an area that Canada needs to supercharge. And it has a great track record. And we're thinking about what kinds of middle power diplomacy that we can engage in the region that brings stability. I think there's some good examples. Following the last nuclear test by our North Korean friends back in the fall of 2019, here in Vancouver, the Canadian government held a meeting on security and stability in the Korean Peninsula. Using our good offices as a middle power, we brought together many countries to come and talk about denuclearization in the peninsula. More of these kinds of activities can be done. Another good example is the coalition of countries against arbitrary detention. And of course our friends like Michael Kovrig, Michael Spravo, which remained in Chinese prisons for more than 1,000 days, were of course part of this process. But Canada has worked very hard to again bring a coalition of countries together to work on these ideas of arbitrary detention. And we should make no mistake, it's not just Canadians that were detained, Japanese, Vietnamese, Australians. Many countries are interested in protecting their citizens in engagement in the region. Another area where I think middle powers can work together is again focusing on economic cohesion. Now, if you looked at the G7 Summit communique, there was an extra communique this year focusing on economic cohesion. Canada worked with Japan and worked with other countries to talk about the importance of building and preventing economic cohesion in the region. Amongst many other opportunities that Canada can engage in terms of dealing with middle power diplomacy, those are three examples that I think are useful. Policymakers need to be more creative in thinking about how they can convene other middle powers to provide collective resources to the region and provide collective diplomatic pressure on various countries to try and shape the region's development. Cyber and digital trade cooperation is another area. At the G20 summit in Osaka, the late Prime Minister Abe put forth an idea called digital free flow of trust. Here again, we see an opportunity for Canada to work with like-minded countries such as Japan to create the rules of the road in terms of the cyber environment and the increasingly important digital trade environment. Today, much of this hard work is being laid out in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I do hope in January, once the initial round one is finished, that Canada will join this network and start to promote cyber and digital cooperation through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or working specifically with partners like Japan to deal with growing challenges associated with cyber threats emanating from many countries within the region. Supply resilience and diversification is another area that I think we all have experienced over the past 3 or 4 years due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw our personal protective equipment not come into the country. We saw delays in the delivery of many goods to our country, to Canada. And I think there's really growing understanding that we need to selectively diversify. I think the European term is de-risking. Selectively diversify supply chains so that if we have another COVID-19 pandemic, or we have policy choices in different countries that affect us, that we can quickly pivot to other regions to provide products that we need for consumption and to keep our economies going. So resilient supply chains is really interesting. And countries like Japan are really on the forefront of building new formulas of cooperation of resilient supply chains. Back in 2019, working with Australia and India, the three countries put together a so-called Resilient Supply Chain Initiative to try and diversify supply chains so that we have stable flows of goods and the production of goods within the region. Here, Canada has a role contributing to these supply chains by working closely with these countries to, again, ensure that supply chain resilience continues to deepen, to prevent another disruption associated with a non-traditional security challenge, such as a transnational disease, or an earthquake, or a tsunami, to ensure that our economies, again, remain stable and access to the goods that we need to, again, keep our Canadians, but also our Japanese friends and other friends employed. Lastly, and this probably connects back to the idea of middle power diplomacy, is working together with like-minded countries like Japan to promote high-standard multilateral trade agreements like the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Most recently, the UK has joined the partnership, and we're likely to see other candidates potentially join this high-quality trade agreement. Some of the key features of the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership include protection of intellectual property rights, high standards for labor and environment, limiting the role of state-owned enterprises. And these are specifically meant to supercharge research and development, to protect innovation, and to create the next innovation that will charge our economies. Working with countries like Japan, we need to look for new partners that can add value to the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. This will be important in terms of making 21st century trade rules that reflect our interests, reflect our comparative advantages, but also protect us from non-market-based intervention in economies. I might add, I think that Japan and Canada can work together to advocate for a potential new agreement in which the United States joins. This is important for us to be thinking about. The current temperature in Washington is not exactly free trade. And there is an expression in the world that I live in, the United States is a free trade agreement maker, not a free trade agreement joiner. I think that we need to work with our Japanese friends and other members of the TPP, again, to put on the table opportunities for the United States to anchor itself in the Indo-Pacific region through trade. This will be important in terms of, again, buttressing a rules-based trade order that, again, locks Canada into the region, that is focused on free and open trade, protecting intellectual property rights, creating the kinds of rules and regulations that will ensure that the digital economy is one that's shaped by rules and not shaped by authoritarian states. So in closing, again, I just want to touch upon those five areas where I think Japan and Canada have a lot of synergy. Security cooperation to promote stability within the region. Second, middle power diplomacy, promoting multilateralism and non-military solutions to Indo-Pacific challenges. Cyber and digital trade cooperation. Supply chain resilience and diversification. And lastly, high standard multilateral trade promotion. Canada and Japan have a lot of synergies, comparative advantages, and they're like-minded countries that can provide a platform for deepening Canadian Indo-Pacific engagement, an engagement that's sustainable, that's meaningful, and that brings value not only to Canadians, but brings values to the region. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And as you can see, friends, we're gradually, I started at 30,000 feet, and things are coming into focus as we go from the globe to the region to now Canada, Japan. And so it's my great pleasure as we move on to introduce again Dr. Tsuyoshi Kawasaki from Simon Fraser University. And Dr. Kawasaki will talk to us about a new framework for Canada-Japan strategic cooperation. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning. Thank you, Jeff. The title of my talk is Toward a New Framework of Canada-Japan Strategic Cooperation in the Face of Systemic Challenges. That's a phrase NATO used to characterize China. And of course, we can include Russia, North Korea, Iran, and so on. But as this title implies, my basic message to you is that current, what I would call policy paradigm, is now inadequate. We have to have fundamental shift. I was involved about 30 years ago when the informal way I was involved when the Canada and Japan started the bilateral security dialogue on the part of Japan. Professor Nishihara, who has retired now, and along with the Brian John of UDC, Johnny wrote up the paper, and eventually it was endorsed by two prime ministers of Japan and Canada, and then the conversation started. That's in the environment of the post-World War, and we really didn't have the harvest threat or systemic challenges. And since then, I've been observing. I've been teaching SAT since 1994, and then looking at these two bilateral relations. I think I'm one of the maybe oldest individual in this room. And then I'm a student of the grand strategy. So I think about big picture like the Kissinger tried it, like Brezhnev, Brzezinski, and so on. So that's my general, if you will, position from which I'm looking at in the modern higher identity that Jeff was talking about. So let me start with the analogy. I'm familiar with all the documents, including 6-point Canada-Japan Action Plan that was signed on by different ministers, as well as of course, the Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy and Japan's new plan for FOI issued by the Kishida government and so on. Now, the way I look at them is that let's step back a bit. An analogy I'm thinking is as follows. So imagine you're a patient, a medical doctor, and then the patient is thinking about having the headache, and then the day is about, okay, I'm gonna give him or her Tylenol, Advil, and so on. That's symptom management, right? But your issue is how to strengthen or think about immune system that would bring health back in the first place. So to use the analogy to the current Canada-Japan relationship, those documents, and the old agenda, I really commend, of course, a detailed agenda. Anyone with those documents, rather simple. I'm more concerned about more foundational framework. You might call it organizational infrastructure or intellectual infrastructure. To use the Kissinger's phrase, program is conceptual, not specific policy agenda. It's much more foundational. So from that perspective, my message is that we need the framework. And I would propose 2 institutional changes and 1 urgent policy agenda. The first one is the centralization of policy framework within Canada, particularly along the National Security Council. That's supposed to be information. And I'll elaborate that later. The second point is that we need to go beyond current existing Canada-Japan diplomatic framework between Garisho on one hand, no offense to Garisho people here on one hand, and then the GAC, Global Affairs Canada on the other. It should be replaced by National Security Council Secretariat in Japan on the one hand, and with the maybe Privy Council based the National Security Secretariat that I presume will be coming soon on the other. And finally, with this new framework, agenda item number 1 has to be Taiwan contingency. All the documents I just mentioned earlier all assume this time cooperation. Right? I don't think we live in that kind of world anymore. We really have to have serious conversation about a Taiwan contingency. So that would be the third part. So let me start with the first part. Centralization within Canada. As we all know, yes, National Security Council was proposed. And I keep checking the, of course I'm not a bureaucrat. I don't have any secret access to the Ottawa. So I'm just using the open sources, looking at global, doing search and so on. We do not know, as of now, where we are. It was proposed to extent, maybe some of you know much more detail than I have. This is very important because National Security Council or National Security Council Secretariat would be coordinating the mechanism for GAC, National Defense, Public Security, Safety Canada, and so on. We need that kind of coordination mechanism. And Canada is unique among the G7 or Five Eyes members because Canada didn't have National Security Council. So I think we need one. And this National Security Council Secretariat should publish, as many other observers have recommended, to publish the National Security Strategy of Canada. That would encompass and explain not only Indo-Pacific region policy, but Arctic and, of course, Atlantic European side. It's important, right? As Arctic is opening up, it would be, if you will, potential theater of strategic competition. It hasn't become one. Then Canada will be surrounded by 2 oceans. We really have to think about implications and then not only for strategic outlook, but also resource allocation. I think I would say it's the first time for this country to face up that kind of strategic environment. Now, in any event, so we need that kind of decentralization and the big picture thinking. Canada's basically grand strategy in which the Indo-Pacific region should fit in. We don't have one. We don't have one. Maybe one, somewhere hidden, but it's not. In addition, I strongly support GACs to reform along the line of the future of the diplomacy. Particularly, we really have to get rid of managerialism. We can talk about that later, if you like. All right, and then we move on to the second element of this new policy paradigm, and that is the institutional change between Tokyo and Ottawa. As I told you earlier, we need to establish the NSS, National Security Secretariat, of those 2 countries. Jody Thomas on the one hand, and then Mr. Akiba on the other at the moment. And then directly reporting to Prime Minister. Okay. And along with the coordination with other national security, head of National Security Council. Why? Because we now live in the, as I told you earlier, competitive environment. And just look at what Canada has been going through. all the departments, units, have to be synchronized, organized. Okay? And for that, you need National Security Council, cabinet level, headed by the Prime Minister, and adequate support by the bureaucracy. Japan made one, as you know, and that has, I think, revolutionized the quality of Japanese foreign policy in the line of bilateral strategy. So we can update later on, perhaps, what exactly is the program of this current boxing framework, so to speak, and no offense to the officials here, or former officials. But I think I'm observing the setup for a long time, and under the current condition where, in fact, the two camps, Western camp that says we want to protect a rules-based order on the one hand, and the challenge on the other. In that context, we really need the much robust, centralized coordination mechanism within the Western camp. In addition, I think it would be a brilliant idea if the Prime Minister of Canada resumes stand-alone visit to Japan, or South Korea, or Australia. Last time, I looked at the record and I was very surprised. Stand-alone, not when Prime Minister go to G7 Summit or any other G20 or what have you. No, stand-alone. Something like the Camp David meetings, that agreement signed by 3 leaders, right? South Korea, Japan, and then the United States in August. We need stand-alone. The last time that happened was with Prime Minister Harper, 2012. Since then, there has been, yes, foreign ministers, yes, different cabinet members, but not Prime Minister. I think we need that. We need that. The presence, when in fact the top level diplomacy is so crowded in the region. August, just think about it. Any series of recent meetings, top leaders, right? Just so you know, Canada and Japan does not have 2+2 cabinet level meetings. Japanese side is so busy, they do that with many other major countries. Canada, on the other hand, has a vice minister level 2+2, the foreign ministry and the defense, but not at cabinet level, and so on. So anyway, we can talk about the current configuration of this institutional setup of the Canada-Japan diplomacy. The point is that I think we have to change that. All right, finally, a Taiwan contingency plan. I'm assuming Japan side is doing it beyond war game. Plan would include the diplomatic front. For example, what are we going to do if Taiwan, under attack, will claim independence? Maybe want to be along the line, I always do that, I'm not good at the Spanish, along the line of the Montevideo principle. What would Japan, Canada, and any other countries do? Countries that so far haven't recognized, right, the government Taipei as the internal diplomatic relationship. What would we do to evacuate Canadian citizens and Japanese citizens? Maybe Canadian citizens may actually go to the Japan first, from Taiwan, and potentially from the mainland. Japanese side, there are about 100,000 Japanese citizens in China. border may be shut off, and they may be taken de facto hostage and so on. How about economic crisis? Tokyo Stock Exchange may crash because of this. It will be first time. It will be first time for Japan to have any engagement if Japan gets involved in Taiwan continues since 1945. That society has never ever experienced what hysteria, stress, war. Right? Anyway, so I'm assuming that the Prime Minister's office in Japan are doing all the simulation and so on. I'm assuming, but I don't know. It's top secret. I'm wondering if the people in Ottawa are doing it in Taiwan contingency. So if I were to recommend the immediate policy action, definitely contingency plan by Canada, for Canada, then start talking to the extent they could, any potential coordination. Scary part is that there could be two-front war on Korean Peninsula on the one hand. North Korea may opportunistically start some sort of action against South Korea when Taiwan contingency arrives. Now, if you look at the Camp David agreement that I just mentioned, the agreement gives framework. Even though South Korea may not directly involve in Taiwan contingency. Okay? So those are actually discussions and speculations quite frequently done among the military experts. But the question remains, it has to be multifaceted, the contingency. Canada may decide, right, depending on scenario, not to be involved at all in a direct way, but then what would be the role of the Canadian and the Pacific Fleet, right? That has been working so hard to become part of the American carrier power group. So, the point here is that, yes, we can keep reading the existing documents, exploring cooperation and so on, but bottom line is that that's basically for peace time. And unfortunately, we are looking at a very, very scary situation where, in fact, Taiwan contingency may occur as early as 2027. I'm not alarmist. Okay? But when you see a lot of the debates and reports in many other, let's say typically Japan, okay? Because it's right there, right? So I think we should start thinking what would be potential role of Canada, if any. And then there are various questions, as I noted, diplomatic, military, economic, and then quote-unquote migration, right? People, Canadians, in Taiwan, as well as China. So anyway, to me, that's writing on the wall. So that sort of response would require centralized institution on top of which you should have National Security Council / Secretariat. Anyway, so maybe I'm too long. Okay, thank you so much. I'm happy to have the Q&A discussion. I hope I was productive enough. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I want to get into some discussion here. And for the next section, we're going to have a discussion among the panelists, and then we're going to throw to you for your questions and comments. So please have them ready. And my first order of business for this next session is to welcome our third panelist as a discussant. Ms. Kyoko Kuwahara is a research fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, visiting fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and she has served as an officer at the Office for Strategic Communication Hub at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan before she joined the Institute of International Affairs, specializing in public diplomacy, strategic communications, disinformation, and soft power strategies. And her most recent published books are about public diplomacy and disinformation, including published in Japanese in 2023, Disinformation Warfare, The War in Your Heads. And I think our heads are all familiar with that war. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Kuwahara.
Did you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with you, Ms. Kuwahara-san, just to kind of take us to the next part of the discussion to talk about the key elements of each country's approach. What does this mean? What do they mean for practically deepening further collaboration and people-to-people ties between Japan and Canada?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Jeff, for your moderating. And if I answer that question, first of all, I would say Japan-Canada cooperation could be the driving force to realize the concept of FOIP, which means free and open Indo-Pacific, which Japan has been advocating the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific since the Abe administration. And this is due to some facts of mainly Chinese aggressive attitude and actions in the East China Sea as well as in South China Sea, among other things. Also, most recently, as Professor Kawasaki, in his initial remarks, he mentioned possibility of Taiwan trade contingency has been garnering a huge attention among Japanese scholars and policymakers and researchers. And Tokyo intensifies its involvement in the Taiwan issue, where China puts pressures on Tokyo. And with these backgrounds, Japan has strongly urged China to abide by the international rules and has claimed a peaceful solution to the Taiwan issue. So with regards to Taiwan, also me and Kawasaki-san and also Nagi-san were talking and discussing about the possibility of the disinformation campaigns developed by China and other actors when it comes to a Taiwan Strait contingency. So also at this moment, a variety of disinformation, misinformation, as well as misinformation campaigns developed. And disinformation campaigns and information warfare are making the situation in the Indo-Pacific more complex and severe. So Japan is more allies and partners in the region to address these issues. And Canada, at this point, Canada could be the strongest partner for Japan in that region to tackle these issues. Canada is aware of very same interests and concerns as Japan has in the region, and Canada's launch of the Indo-Pacific Strategy last year is very important and critical not only for Japan but also for the future in the Indo-Pacific. So as well as the people-to-people interaction between two countries, Japan and Canada. So what kind of collaboration and cooperation between Canada and Japan could be developed as a key element to realize for the concept free and open in the Pacific? For instance, Japan and Canada cooperation is Japan-Canada cooperation in leading international discussions, regional conferences among Indo-Pacific countries, members, and regions, and even G7 summit meetings and discussion in a coordinated manner is important with emphasis on the international maritime rules. Also, Canada's leading efforts in countering disinformation campaigns and information warfare are very much valuable and should be learned lessons from Canada. And I believe this is the important area that both countries should work together. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like to come back to our other speakers on a few points. And I would start, Stephen, with you. You've outlined areas, 5 areas for deepened cooperation and opportunities, things to explore for Canada and Japan. Are there maybe 3 things that you would identify as immediate steps? I mean, I think that Dr. Kawasaki has already outlined very practical things in terms of institutional mechanics and that sort of thing to be done right away. Do you have something kind of in terms of like, what do we do tomorrow to advance this agenda?
Thanks, Jeff. So I did point out 5, I think, areas that we can cooperate in, but in order of priority, I guess maybe I differ a little bit from Kawasaki-san and say that I think Taiwan contingency, it's important to think about, but as Canadians we have limited resources. And as a result, we need to find ways to coordinate with our Japanese and other friends. We can't just do this with the Japanese. We have to coordinate with many countries that share the same interests in terms of those critical sea lines of communication that are in and around Taiwan. So thinking about national security coordination, is a bilateral approach the best way to do this? And my view is no. I think that we need to have a multilateral approach that, again, continues to use diplomacy to send the strongest of signals to revisionist countries that peace and stability across this Taiwan Straits is a global interest. How to do this? I think we've already seen it. If you look at the Suga-Biden statement in 2021, peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait was in that statement. And then in the NATO statement, and the G7 statement, and the Hiroshima G7 statement, the NATO AP4 statement, we have to use our diplomatic tools to continue to communicate. And we can do that now. So I think that's the first step. Rather than coordination at the national security level, is to use our diplomatic resources to coordinate shared messaging on priorities in the region. Second, I think that coordinating our approach to building a rules-based region means concrete action on expanding trade agreements like the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Who are future candidates? How can we facilitate their involvement? Are there creative ways that we can bring new countries into these rule-making and rules-based trade agreements? This is important. And I think we can do this right now. I think this is something we can do. Third, and I think this is important that we can do right now, and the question that you asked is about expanding people-to-people ties as well, is that I'm such a fan or supporter of student exchanges. I think that when students experience another country, that country will be with them forever. So, and I know, again, buying another naval vessel in Canada is not going to provide a tremendous amount of deterrence. But sending 1,000 Canadian students to Japan to study, to build friendships, to work, and for Japan to do the same will build the lifelong kinds of relationships we need to maintain our shared values, to build understanding and again to contribute to stability in the region. Without doing those kinds of exchanges, I think that we won't be able to maintain the strong ties we need to be on the same page of the book when we have real challenges moving forward.
Okay, well those are very practical suggestions, and I think there are elements to build on there. Some of you in this room have been involved over the years in the Kakehashi exchange program, which is a project of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, implemented by the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada for more than a decade now. And some of you, I think, have met with these groups when they've come through Vancouver. But this is a modest program, and I would certainly endorse the idea that we need to scale up these kinds of exchanges. I think it will be an interesting thing to be seen in the Indo-Pacific Strategy. There's millions and millions of dollars for initiatives which have not been defined in great detail yet. I mean, I don't see that in itself as a weakness of the strategy. These things take time, but there are elements of the strategy. If you look at, there's an annex to the strategy document that came out last November that lists the different funded initiatives. You'll see our little piece of it right at the end, but there are bigger initiatives of tens of millions of dollars over 5 years that are to be devoted to increasing academic exchanges, other kinds of people-to-people exchanges, and I think we all need to be paying close attention and also to be pressing the government to roll out these programs. I do think it can be a difference maker in our relationships, and priority should go to those areas where we think we can have the biggest impact. And I have Kawasaki-san, I have a kind of a follow-on to your presentation. I wanted to ask you, with regard to the Taiwan contingency planning, and I mean presumably the governments have for things like evacuation of citizens, you know, I mean I can say without revealing confidences, in any kind of a danger zone around the world, you know, the Canadian government, as other governments, would have an evacuation plan. I had the opportunity to say that publicly when I was Consul General in Hong Kong, and it became a huge story. But it's just what we do. So you know, I think the elements of contingency planning are presumably there behind the curtain. I'd like to ask if your thinking is that an important aspect of what you are asking for is that there be a public element to this, that they be seen to be doing contingency planning, and if so, I think that can lead us into other questions.
Of course. Thank you. My quick answer is no. It can just be confidential.
Okay.
Has to be confidential. Has to be confidential. As opposed to open. So I'm hoping that the systematic plan has been formulated and communicated among the partners. So the quick answer is no. It has to be confidential.
Yeah.
Has to be confidential.
Okay, well I think that's an important clarification, because I think when we talk about Taiwan scenarios, one we can do a whole other day on the question of whether we all are made more or less secure through explicit alliance formation or kind of red lines, as opposed to strategic ambiguity. And you can get into a really rich discussion on that. I'm not proposing we do that right now, although if there are folks who want to pursue that in a Canada-Japan context, we can certainly get into it. And then I'd like to ask you, Kuwahara-san, about your 3 things that you think we should embark on, first in expanding the relationship.
Thank you. I think my second point and the third point will be coincident with what Stephen said. And first thing will be a non-traditional security cooperation between Canada and Japan. This is kind of a specific area to cooperate. And the second is strengthening strategic communication between two countries. And the third is intellectual cooperation from my side. So kind of the student cooperation, student exchange should be more promoted. As Stephen said, I strongly agree on his idea. So my second point and third point kind of means to realize my first point of non-traditional security cooperation. So non-traditional security cooperation means the cooperation in terms of cognitive domain, which is now very much emphasized on by the Japanese government as well as scholars and researchers, with the advancement of the information and communication technology as well as generative AI, such as ChatGPT. Also, conventional Japanese information warfare counter approach or disinformation countermeasures, Japan has been lagging far behind in countermeasures against disinformation and information warfare, which is actually because of the fact that Japan has never been seriously affected by foreign disinformation campaign compared with other Western countries as well as Taiwan. Because there are some linguistic barriers as well as Japan has been historically or traditionally far from the other country, isolated from the other countries. So some experts say they call this Galapagos syndrome. So that's why the countermeasures has been not well fully developed. But with the Japanese government just launched the new national security last year, recognizing the more countermeasures should be developed within the government to counter disinformation in this very century. But now Japan is just a beginner to develop the countermeasures, and Canada is kind of a leading country among G7 members in that sense, in terms of the developing countermeasures against disinformation, such as RN and rapid response mechanisms, so on and so forth. So here, Japan should learn the lessons and what kind of good practices that Canada has experienced to realize the more multifaceted coordination and cooperation with Canada. So also my second point, strengthening strategic communication between two countries. As I said, Japan recognized the current security environment in the Indo-Pacific is the most severe and complex since the Second World War, based on the understanding with which it updated its national security strategy. On the other hand, Canada, it launched the Indo-Pacific Strategy with the understanding that the Indo-Pacific will be playing a critical role for the future of Canada. So also, this is also well recognized among Western countries, including Canada, that what's happening in Ukraine at this moment will happen or would happen in the Indo-Pacific tomorrow. So here, Japan, of course, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy is very much welcome and appreciated by the Japanese government as well as the scholars and researchers. But the question is whether the message that Canada has put out will translate into the actual action. So this is a Canada and Japan. So Japan probably, as Nagi-san knows, Japan is not good at promoting strategic communication traditionally, but Japan should act more actively develop strategic communication, especially towards Canada, to secure and make sure its actual engagement and commitments in the region. So this is my second point, to strengthen strategic communication by the Japanese government. And also, finally, intellectual exchange is, of course, this is one means of cooperation to realize the non-traditional security studies and joint research among their counterparts. Also, as we all know, intellectual collaboration is one means of public diplomacy at grassroots level. And as the only Japanese researcher in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, I realized that how small number of Japanese scholars and researchers visit their counterparts to have an opinion exchange or joint research, whatever the collaboration occasions and opportunity to Canada. And Japanese researcher experts who specialize in North America tends to go to the United States to see their counterparts, not to Canada. And, but what happened in the last 12 or 11 months since I settled in Ottawa, there is a small but a certain number of Japanese experts have visited Canadian counterparts to have an opinion change or to seek a future collaboration or collaborating opportunity, because I was acting as a bridge builder. So this is one kind of collaboration mechanism or cooperation mechanism among both countries' intellectuals that we should not stop promoting the interaction among intellectuals so that it would also shape the future Japan-Canada relation.
Yeah, well, those are great. Those are great observations, and I would just myself observe that in terms of taking action in promoting intellectual cooperation, strategic discussions. Full credit to the government of Japan for the fact that we're doing this right now here today. So you are all now part of this. So the vision becomes real, and I would say also in the context of Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy and the resources that are to be rolled out over the next few years, that this is, I think, just a really important element, is to facilitate that and to use, by devoting more money to these kinds of activities, to be able to attract scholars from Asia who are going to the US all the time. I think there's an opportunity for us to catch some of that flow. I mean, we're in British Columbia, so I think of us being kind of bears watching the salmon run by, and there's so many of these salmon, going up the river, that we can, and if we talk about scholars going to the U.S., even just to the west coast of the U.S., that we only need to pick out a few, to have some really tasty meals. So be ready with your questions and comments. I'm going to come to you in just a minute, but I'm going to come back to Stephen for one more comment.
So just one area that I think is important is to reflect upon the centers of Asian or Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific research in Canada. And the reality is our universities, I don't think, are producing the kinds of experts that we need to fill the roles in GAP or fill the roles in defense and understand how integrated the region is. And Kawasaki-san talked a lot about security and Taiwan, but I think we can no longer disconnect economic security and national security, and we need to create programs that reflect how integrated the region is and how codependent the region is and the complexities of the politics, the security, and economic relationships within the region. What we can do quickly, I think we need some Canadian research chairs that will spearhead these kinds of initiatives to train the next generation of individuals that will help us negotiate the complexities of the region. Working with Japan, working with South Korea, working with Southeast Asia, yes, working with China. We need to include China in this dimension. I know it's hard, but we need to have experts come in and give those lectures and expose our students to the region's heterogeneity. Japan is a great partner to do this, and I think this is such an important initiative in Canada. Homework, I'm a professor, I'll give you homework. Go on your Google, do a quick search on HNet, and look at the kind of jobs in Canadian universities that are being offered. There are no positions or very few positions that are focusing on China, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, India. We need those experts, but we need an integrated program that links the region. So that's my wish list, and I'm happy to contribute.
Well, it's also our mandate at the foundation, so we are on. That's why we're drawing to a close now. I'd like to give a big thanks to our Indo-Pacific Foundation of Canada team for the work in setting this up, to our partners at Simon Fraser University, beautiful space and facilities. I would especially like you to join me in thanking our panelists and speakers, Kuhara-san, Kawasaki-san, Nagi-san. Thank you so much for your contribution. And finally, before you tuck into the buffet, it's a good moment to thank once again our partners and colleagues from the Consulate General of Japan and the Government of Japan for generous support for this event. Please join me in thanking them. And we look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you very much, everybody.